After every interview I have with somebody, I go back and listen to that interview. Sometimes quite a few times. I'm editing. I'm trying to think about how to position the intro and outro to this. Steve Jones was a unique interview in that I was at a kind of a loss. What do I do for the intro and outro? There is so much information here. There is so much value for every single business here, and I'm always trying to think like, how do I summarize this? How do I help somebody understand? Here's what we're going to get into. We are going to start with behavioral interviewing, really, in general, and really go through what is a behavioral interview and what is the value to an organization to interview in this way. But then we're also going to talk about job descriptions. We're going to talk about the cost of getting this wrong. We're going to be talking about how to find the right interview. There is a lot surrounding behavioral interviewing that we will get into that will bring value to you. I'm really looking forward to how much value you receive from this, and I'd love to hear back from anyone on kind of what stood out to you by the end. I will summarize some things at the end, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing this. I don't want to take away from this interview, and actually I encourage you to listen to it over and over again so you get full value from what was said. Enjoy. Welcome, Steve Jones, for this next episode in the Traits Podcast. Really, again, the focus of this is higher performing organizations, and we're going to get into this in just a second with your experience. But because of your experience, it was easy to talk about traits and psychometric assessment tools again, which we can get into a little bit. But what I wanted to do is go a little bit different because of your experience. We'll talk about kind of a different topic. We'll get into that in a second as well. So let's start. Steve, talk about your background a little bit. You've got a background in recruitment. You've got a background in other business and consulting. You're up to other businesses right now, but maybe give a brief understanding of kind of where you're coming from in all of this.
Sure, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to your podcast. Um, yeah, I have got about 40 years of experience, most of it in and around the recruitment and staffing services industry. I started a company back in 1983 with a partner who had lots of money and more experience than me. And we built a staffing company from 2 or 3 employees up to 22 offices and close to $500 million in revenue. And we filled about 20 to 30,000 jobs a year in the end when I finally decided to sell that business and move away from it. But during all that time, we did some acquisitions. We bought other staffing companies, and I served as president several times of our National Industry Association. So I received some very insightful perspectives of different aspects of the recruitment and staffing industry, not only from how recruitment companies work, but also we dealt with about 900 companies. So we got to see how banks do their recruiting and oil and gas companies do their recruiting and governments do their staffing and healthcare does their staffing and manufacturing does theirs. So we got a lot of perspective from different angles while we went through that process.
Okay, then before we get into the big question I'm going to be asking you is about behavioral interviewing. Before we get into that, all these hundreds of companies that you've worked with, what were the top two or three mistakes that you saw happen when recruitment was trying to take place?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, well, I'm not a big fan of panel and group interviewing. I think that they become so structured and so clinical that they really lose the aspect of understanding people. They're looking for these answers that fit their metrics, and they're scoring people based upon how they answer the questions. And at the end of the day, high performance people, great employees, and particularly, and we'll get back to this part too, employees who stay with your organization. I mean, retention of good quality people is really what it's all about. Comes from having a matching, people talk about mission, vision, culture, about these cultural interviews, but it really comes from having an understanding of people's predominant, predictable, recurring traits, understanding how they're going to behave, and that those behaviors are really closely aligned with the those that are needed by the corporation or by the organization, but also that are particularly unique to each job because each job doesn't, there's something that's got to be in common amongst all of the people, and yet every job has very unique requirements, and so they require very unique personality traits. And I think, very often we see people having these very structured interviews with predetermined questions and predetermined answers with scoring metrics and matrices and panels, and they just end up hiring people who give good answers but not necessarily good people.
I want to leap off into that into so many different directions, Steve. I appreciate that because I think you covered probably five great tips all in that. Uh, Maybe what I'll do is say what should be the goal of a recruitment interview. You talked about the goal, kind of getting the right answers or the going through the standard procedure. What should be the goal? You hinted at this earlier.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's face it. There's some obligatory requirements in every job. If you're hiring nurses, you better be certified with the nursing association or nursing body in your province in Canada or your area. If you're looking for IT professionals and you're really focused on one particular piece of software or type of technology, then you got to make sure that people meet the obligatory or the mandatory requirements. And so nobody should be getting to the final interview unless you know that they can do the job. Do they have the education? Do they have the skills? Do they have the knowledge? Do they have the experience? And I think that's the easy part to figure out. I was just at a conference, by the way, in Montreal with the recruitment and staffing services industry, and the big thing is AI right now. And I was amazed by how many speakers were talking about trying to figure out the truth about candidates because they're using AI to present themselves, and then the recruiting companies are using AI to vet whether or not they are actually telling the truth. But once we've established that a person has the qualifications to be in the final interview stage, then really what we're looking for are these personality traits because people can learn new things. People can learn new skills and stuff is going to change. And we're going to need people to change with the stuff as it changes. So it's the person that's not going to change. It's their honesty or their integrity or their grit or, their stamina or, their organizational, their need, want, desire to be social, like all of those traits about their personality that are not going to change. And so I think the interviewers really need to learn to spend more time being flexible in asking and learning how to ask questions so that they can really feel comfortable and confident in what that person's personality is like. And you got to remember, they're going to candidates are going to perform usually going to perform their best in the interview and may never ever be that good again. They're practicing for that interview, they're focused on that interview. So we need to try to find out what people are really like.
So getting under the
And
surface, getting to know somebody at their core rather than what they're presenting, what's easy to present on a piece of paper through ChatGPT, right? So let's from that, let's get right into behavioral interviewing. So what is behavioral interviewing? What is the purpose? What is kind of the framework that it uses?
yeah, so first off, I like to think of this acronym CAR: context, actions, and results. So um, we're going to look in a behavioral interview, we're going to look for situations that the person has been involved in before, whether they're analogous to it, similar to it, or exactly the same to the kind of situations that you think the person is going to be involved with in your organization. And so we look for and ask for questions to try to find out when have you been confronted with this in the past? And tell me all about it so that we get some context to determine how similar is that to what we expect they're going to be experiencing when they work with us. How similar are those problems? How similar are those challenges? How similar are those goals and objectives and the types of people they're going to deal with and teams and so on? How similar are they? So once we have determined that we've got context, then we want them to tell us stories about what they did This is the action part of the car, of the A in car. Tell us what they did. And at the end of the day, we want to then find out, how did that work out? How did that work out for you? What were the results from that? And we do this by beginning. I like to approach it by going in a reverse chronological order, starting at the most recent jobs and going backwards in time. And by doing that, we get the person to tell a story about why they changed jobs, what they were looking for when they changed jobs, what were the circumstances that made them think about changing careers or jobs or companies or roles inside their company. And did they get it? Did they get what they wanted? And then to tell stories about that, about why it worked out or why it didn't work out. And so we're really getting some context about what's been motivating this person's path in their life, and we do it in these wide, open-ended questions, just like the kind of questions you're asking me. You're asking me, you're allowing me to talk and tell a story by asking me these big, broad questions. And then as we start to hear the answers, we start to drill in a little bit. Tell me more about that. Let's focus on that story. Let's get down, then eventually right down to the nitty gritty. How did that work out? What did you do? How did that work out? How did the other people respond to it? And so the questions become more and more closed until eventually it's almost yes and no questions at the end so that we can really get a focus on what happened and what the outcome was. So we start with these big, broad, open-ended questions, trying to figure out what drives this person and where they go. And then we narrow in on their stories and their storyline, picking parts of it and focusing in on it. And they may never know what direction we're going. I'll give you an example. I might ask a question. I might ask a person, who was your best boss ever in your career? And tell me about that person and why they were so great. Now, a lot of people think the question is exactly what the question is. Like they want to know who that great person was and all about them. I really couldn't care less who that person was, what their name was, what company they worked for. I want to know why the candidate thought they were great. I want to know what it was that they saw in that motivated them, that made them feel inspired, that made them act and to be the best that they could be, which tells me more about the candidate than it does about the manager they're describing. And so by asking this big question, like in your whole life, tell me about the best. And then we can start to, as they start to answer that question, we can start to ask, how did they manage you? Was it about the detail? Did you need to be told? Did you like not to be told? Did you like to be micromanaged? You're not micro. You can really start to figure out what makes that person tick by using this context, action, results form of behavioral based interviewing that goes in a reverse chronological order using open ended questions and then drilling down into the finer, more closed ended specific parts of the questions.
When I think about this process, I think about different interviews that I've been part of and how many times I've been asked questions like, and I would call this an attempt at behavioral interviewing done really, really poorly, where somebody goes, tell me about a situation where you failed at this and how you handled it. And it's trying to get like a very simplistic understanding of somebody. Whereas what you're talking about is both broad and deep. How long does it take to go through a behavioral interviewing process? Because you're talking about a completely different investment into truly understanding who this person is.
Yeah, all kinds of people in the industry would disagree with me on this because they're focused on process and efficiency. And sometimes it becomes very obvious that a candidate is not that good
Mm-hmm.
and we're not perfect. And so maybe you want to bail out. But I can't imagine an important job um, and a good quality interview taking less than an hour. I just can't imagine it. You need to begin the interview with this other part of the behavioral based interview that has to deal with the 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 introduction interaction. How easily does this person nurture and develop rapport? How comfortable do they feel in engaging in a conversation where they might feel a little uncomfortable because it's an important moment and they don't know where it's going to go? And do they control the process? Are they passive to the process? Um, do, how do they react when they get caught off guard? If you start off by asking them personal questions about their drive into work and what it was like, and do they feel comfortable with that? Um, just even things like where do they sit? How do they sit? What's their body language like? These are all parts of the interview that need to maybe take 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 minutes in the beginning before you even get started that help you start to formulate your opinions about the candidate. Now, we love automations and we love online interviewing. Video interviewing has been around long before pandemic, and it became a pretty common process. Um, but it's just not the same. You got to get those people. If you can, you got to get those people in front of you.
Yeah, and you're again, you're coming from a different perspective here than so much of what happens in the industry or any industry. One thing that I'm pulling out from this is that from the time that somebody enters that room, the behavioral interview has begun. And when you're asking questions about the drive home from work, again, it's not about the drive home from work or to work or whatever it is, or to the interview. It's about how people are interacting with you. Again, with this some kind of metric in the back of your head. And some question that came up for me was, hold on, how much note taking are you doing during the interview with a set of metrics or assessment kind of points, or how much are you simply taking notes and then reviewing that afterwards?
Yeah, I'm probably, if you were to do a profile on me, I'm not the most disciplined person. So uh, I don't even write notes, in sentences and lines. I'm writing words all over the page and I'm circling things and putting arrows from one point to the next and connecting thoughts together. So God, I'd hate to pass it over to some administrator and ask them to sort of document my interview notes. Um, but yeah, we're looking at a few things. I mean, number one is, um, ask about the drive to work. What is it telling us? Were you organized? Did you plan it in advance? Did it matter to you that you were on time? How much time and effort did you put in planning your route so that you wouldn't get caught in traffic, so you wouldn't be late for this, very important interview? Did you have other, you don't want to get into prohibited grounds of discrimination, but did you have other obligations in the morning? And how important were they to you? Isn't it doesn't matter to me whether a person has children or they don't have children. What matters to me, for example, is how important was that? That's all. It only matters to me is what are your priorities? It tells me something about your values and the way you think. So did the drive stress you? Did the traffic, how did you react to the unexpected closed parking lot and the difficulty of getting into this place? Those are all parts of it. And then to your other point earlier, that you made too, and I think I made was how comfortable do you feel in, are you making eye contact? Are you developing a relationship? Are you wooing me into your, is it a sales job? And you're wooing me into your circle so I feel I want to be around you? Or is it a back office accounting job where I don't want people to talk to anyone? I want them to put their head down, and just focus on the facts and the numbers. How do people, all of these things tell us something. They tell us something.
Yeah, and again, I just want to be very clear for anyone listening to this episode that you are not looking for everybody to be personable. You're not looking for everyone to fill that sales role. You're looking for certain roles. You're looking for somebody who is not comfortable with people. They're comfortable with the task at hand, correct?
Exactly. Exactly. So I think that there's two aspects to this. There's the aspect of corporate culture, and then there's the aspect of personality as it suits the role. And sometimes they're not exactly the same. So we look for this thing that I call a compelling future focus. This is the thing about the organization, about the mission, the vision, the values. It is that thread or that piece of wool that is woven between all of the people. Then, when pulled, it pulls them all together so that they've got this common feeling of this future, where they're going together, that they all believe in something about the quality or the mission of the organization or the thing that they do or the change they make in lives or the widget that they make is better than others or being on time or being perfect or being exciting or whatever it is that it is about that company and that organization that weaves them all together. So I call it the compelling, we're compelled to do it, the future, where we want to go, and the focus, the most important part of it. That's something that whether you're in accounting or you're in sales, you need to have in common with other people. Otherwise, you're going to be in conflict. The salespeople and the administrators are going to be in conflict with each other because they're even though they're different kinds of personalities and different people, when they have something in common, they understand why each one of them brings special value. And then there is that difference in the person in the back office in accounting and the person who's out in sales, where the personality traits need to be unique and specific to that role. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago when we first had our first conversation about how interviewers often hire in their own image. And a lot of times you get recruiters and managers hiring a lot of the exact same kind of people, and it doesn't really work out. They want them to be like the manager, who might be an entrepreneur and who would be a terrible accountant or bookkeeper or data entry operator or scientist, in the laboratory. And so we don't want to hire in our own image. We want to know exactly what the image of the role is. So finding the compelling feature focus, what do we all have in common, is one thing. And then respecting and understanding and giving value to the differences of the people in each of their roles and how they contribute to the organization is something else. And putting those two things together allows you to figure out who and how the combination of people is going to make it an extraordinary contribution to the company. Not just a predictable one, but an extraordinary one.
Right. So again, another question comes up for me, which is before the interview, then there needs to be a lot of work done on what is this role, what is needed for this role. Often what I see in an organization is they've had roles for a long time, a job description for a long time that they're just recycling over and over and over again. How much time would you suggest or energy effort needs to be put into a new job description each and every time somebody is hiring? How much time can go between somebody needs to rethink that, or what changes before somebody needs to rethink that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me come at. I'm gonna try to answer that question, but maybe in a different way.
Yep.
One of the most common mistakes that organizations make is that they start off with developing a staffing model or staffing plan. So you've got your business objectives and you've got your pro formas and your financial projections, and then you figure out what kind of people do I need to do this, and they develop a staffing model, and they really develop this kind of utopic special organization, knowing what each role is. Then they hire people, and let's pretend for a moment that they do a great job, that they just hire all the right people in the right seats on the bus, and then someone um, retires. Someone else goes on maternity leave. Someone else leaves the organization because of it's important that they go work in the family business. That somebody gets sick and dies. Everybody pitches in. They start moving jobs around. Then the person's son or daughter comes in for the summer and they're going to cover, but they have some of the skills, but not all the skills. They teach them to do things. Next thing you know, 3 years later, the organization doesn't look anything structured, anything like the one it did before. And I'm going to give you an example. I worked with this charity one time that had a very specific purpose. And then they hired a grants analyst or a grants writer, a grants writer, who had very specific past experience in writing grants for something a little bit different. And at the end of 2 years, they'd received all of these grants to do things that they didn't do before. And the entire focus and direction of the organization has changed. And people in roles in the organization no longer had value like they did 2 years or 3 years earlier when they had a very specific mandate. They built this charity and this organization with something very specific in mind. And here we were, not more than 2 years after this one person was hired, and the entire organization had changed because they hired one person who didn't fit the role, who took them down a path. And next thing you know, they started to change everything to match their revenue, not to match their goals. And the organization almost failed. I mean, we got in there and the board of directors, got things back on track again. But had they kept going down that path, they would have been in deep trouble. And organizations do this all the time. They do it unwittingly, they do it unknowingly, they do it innocently. They think that they're being adaptive and agile. My goodness, agile, they're just so agile. When I hear a company talk about them being agile, I think, what have you screwed up and tried to accommodate for recently? What are you not doing that's according to plan? That you have to think you have to do differently now. And this happens when you don't structure. It can happen, one, because organizations change and you don't stick to the plan, or two, you just don't do it right in the first place. You just don't structure those roles and say, I'm going to wait until I find that piece of the puzzle that fits the needed piece of the puzzle. But I want to change the puzzle. I want to find the piece of the puzzle. Now, it's possible, it's very possible, that an organization can create a unicorn piece of puzzle that it's almost impossible to fill. In which case, they kind of need to take a step back and reassess. Do we need to simplify this puzzle a little bit so the pieces are bigger, that it isn't so specific. But, I think that needs to be done all the time, every time. But we also need to be conscious and cautious of the fact that we're not overdoing it and changing the organization's focus and purpose just because a job opened up and became available.
Right. So when is that time or frequency? It's going to be different depending on growth, depending on a million factors, I'm sure. But when is that time where people need to re-look at their org design and what to tweak?
Well, I like to use the expression more like this. When something's going right, do more like that. Um, when you're sailing a sailboat and you trim the sails, that means that you're adjusting your sails to match the wind and the direction that you're on at that moment. And so if you need to let them out, let them out, let them out until the sail luffs, until it fails a little bit, till it's not perfect anymore, then you pull it back in. So we want to do more like that, more of the good thing to maximize our potential until maybe we do too much. And so we just have to feel that we have to do more like this. And then we have to combine that with something that's almost the exact opposite. That when things aren't working out, we have to remember that if we keep on doing what we've been doing, we're going to keep on getting what we've been getting. And so, if we just look at the basic rules, you keep on doing what you've been doing, you're going to keep on getting what you've been getting. If you're not like what you're getting, step back and ask, what are we doing? Why are we doing it this way? Is it the right thing to do? Should we change that job description? Should we change the role? Should we change the direction? Should we change our priorities? And if you're not getting the outcomes and the results that you want, you either have to ask the question, is it because we're not executing well, or because we've picked the wrong club?
Right.
Are we not hitting the ball well, or did we actually choose the wrong club out of the bag?
You gave two scenarios now there, kind of trimming the sails in two different scenarios. One
Yeah.
is when there's a strong wind behind us, and we need to maximize that. And I'm going to focus on this in a minute. The second example you gave was when things are going a little pear-shaped. I'm guessing that it's easier to tell when things are pear-shaped than to tell when you're maximizing all the wind behind you. Is that accurate? And if it is, how can you tell that perfect balance? How do you know when you're maximizing the wind and getting all of it in your sail?
Well, you almost have to do too much and then back up. You never really know. Like um, only fear will stop you from doing it again and again and again and more. So when you're doing things well and things are working out, if you hired two salespeople and your sales went up by $2 million, and you hired three salespeople and went up by $1 million, and you hired another salesperson and went up by 900,000, that's probably still pretty good. Then you hired another one that goes up by eight. Now you have to ask the question: is eight enough? Is seven enough? And are we getting seven because we're letting the sale out too far? We've now gone too far, and maybe it's time to back up, or are we not executing well? So now you put all your effort into the execution. And if you're convinced you're executing well and it's still at 70% of the previous 100%, then maybe you've gone too far. Or maybe you've gone just far enough. Your math will tell you, is your next sales, is your 22nd salesperson's productivity enough to keep 22 salespeople? Or do I go back to 21?
That makes
And
sense.
yeah, and the problem that, like, you hear organizations say, oh, they're cutting back on, whole divisions and 20% of their salespeople and stuff. That's because they didn't stop and measure along the way. They said we're gonna more like this. They hired five, it worked out great. They hired 10, it worked out great. They hired 15, it worked out great. They hired 20, it didn't work out great. They hired 25, it didn't work out great. Now they got to go all the way back to 15 again because they weren't measuring. And so it's really, really, really important. This is a different topic, but you gotta measure everything.
And
And
you, and using your analogy here, Steve, there are different times where the wind is going to be stronger. And
yeah,
so reassessing is vital to this process. Okay, so we were going off a little off topic there. Let's go back to behavioral interviewing. So somebody they've been watching the wind, they've been trimming the sails, they've been reanalyzing what do we need in our organization. Now going to that job description, getting ready for a behavioral interview. How does somebody need to write the right job description so that they will get the most out of their interview?
yeah. So that's a great question, and there's not a great answer, by the way, because the vast majority of the job description is going to be focused on those obligatory skills and experiences. They're going to be based upon you can't get to the final interview, you can't get to the final five unless you possess all of this stuff. And that might eliminate 95% of your candidates right off the bat. So now you're down to your final five. Then what I think organizations need to do a better job of, some do a great job of it, but most organizations need to do a better job, is establishing outcomes in the job description. It's not just enough to say what they're going to do. It's more important to establish very clearly what they must accomplish, what the goals and objectives are in the things that they're going to accomplish in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. And that people get measured and judged and rewarded for what they accomplish. And we know that they're performing well. I mean, there's only two reasons, I mean, you mentioned that the wind does go up and down, it does change. But either someone doesn't execute well or the plan was wrong. Like either it wasn't a perfect plan. And if it's not a perfect plan, then your organization needs to modify the plan altogether, not just one person, but people need to decide what should we do differently, to make it go. But we need to spend more time in writing that job description, in defining exactly what the priorities are in the outcomes. And I really think a lot of organizations don't do that. They describe the tasks. They describe the tasks. And people can get really caught up in the tasks and not caught up in the outcomes. And in order for a great behavioral based interview to work, we need to know what they need to accomplish, not just the task. The task is easy. You don't need a behavioral based interview for a task. You could use it. Tell me about a time when you, built a widget, but how good did it work? How did that mousetrap catch mice? You can do that, but that's the obligatory stuff. That's the easy thing to figure out. So we need to try to figure out how many mice, how fast are the mice, How inexpensive does it need to be? How many more do we need to get to market? All the things in the goals and objectives need to be written into the job description. And that's what we measure the person's performance on, not the tasks.
You were touching on it right at the end there. Give an example, very specific for listeners, showing the difference between the tasks and the outcome.
Okay. Um, yeah, I'm gonna speak in riddles again too, because um, if you know what your outcome needs to be, you should be able to define the tasks in order to get there. So if you need to go 10 yards, you need to know you got to take 10 big steps. And so you can measure tasks on a very short term basis, daily, weekly, maybe month at the most. That's the longest you would ever want to measure tasks and judge people based upon whether they perform their tasks. And then those tasks need to be closely aligned to, this is where we say the rubber meets the road. If the task is directly related to the outcome that you want, that's a great task. If the task is two steps removed from the outcome you want and it eventually feeds to it, that's not as high a priority. It might be necessary, but not as high a priority. So we want to measure people in short time frames on tasks that are directly related to the outcomes. And then we want to define outcomes and longer periods. So maybe we're measuring the tasks every day, we're measuring the outcome at the end of the week. We're measuring the tasks every week, we're measuring the outcome at the end of the month. And then we reward people, we attaboy people on the tasks, yay, rah, rah, rah. And we reward people with the big rewards, the prizes, the financial rewards, with their outcomes. And they need to be congruent. They need to be tied together, serving the same purpose. Did I answer your question, or did I go off on another tangent?
I think you did both, which I appreciate. Thank you, Steve. I'm thinking, I'm putting some of this together in my brain. And one question that comes up just as you were talking there is that it would be easy for somebody who is not skilled in behavioral interviewing to have false positives and false negatives. When they get an example from somebody, when they hear the story, when they've got open-ended questions of reading into something and thinking, oh, this person is not good at this because of X. And maybe they're misreading it. So maybe what are some examples of when you've done that or you've seen other people doing it, and what would you do to correct that?
Um, Mark, that is really a good observation, and it's so true. Some people get it in their head that they think an answer means something specifically. Okay, so if a person drives a muscle car with furry dice hanging from the rear view mirror, and they keep their car perfectly clean all the time and they're very proud of it. Is it because they're very technical and they love the mechanics of it? Is it because they think that's what girls like and they're very social and they want to use it to meet girls? Is it because they're very fastidious and organized, and so they want it to be perfectly clean with not a, and it doesn't matter whether it was a muscle car or an MGB or a Volkswagen van, it's going to be perfectly clean? So a lot of interviewers get into the find the fault of hearing an answer that meant something to a particular candidate who's in the job now or who had the job before, and they see something similar in the next candidate and they think it means the same thing. When in the case of the muscle car, it could have been technically inclined, it could have been socially girl crazy, it could have been organized and disciplined. I don't we don't know what it means. So the the it has to be on balance. You have to, that's just why the interview takes an hour, because you keep going back through different topics and different discussions and looking for recurring themes that start to help you pull it all together. But any one answer on its own can be wildly misinterpreted. And we find less experienced people or hard-headed people, even very experienced hard-headed people. I have one customer who does, oh my goodness, they do so many profiles because they've of their candidates because I've convinced them to not trust their own judgment. They are just so fixated on some things. They're just not appropriate, you know? And so they do we constantly all the time say no, yes, no, yes, no, yes. And the interesting thing is this is a new topic, but it's important. Organizations are going to find good people and they're going to hire people they like. And if they are good, they're going to work out. Behavioral interviewing and profiling, traits profiling, helps us to avoid the mistake of hiring the wrong people. The good people we're probably going to hire anyways, no matter what. You think you got three really good people, you might hire all three of them. The good ones you're going to hire anyways. It just might turn out that two of them weren't that good. And so the behavioral based interviewing and the traits profiling helps us to figure out who those two non superstars are. Because the cost of bringing somebody into the organization who you think that maybe the cost is firing them and the severance package. That's that's a drop in the bucket in terms of the cost of letting the unproductive non-superstar go. Think about all the opportunity cost, the customers you didn't get, the millions of dollars in sales that you didn't get, the customers who found it easy or indifferent to change suppliers, not because they felt like you did anything wrong, but because they didn't feel like the relationship they had with their customer service rep or their sales rep or the person that can be a barrier to exit. Having a strong relationship with your vendor can be a barrier to leaving. And so having the wrong people can maybe just make the customer indifferent. And so you lose them and you have more turnover. It could mean not maximizing your sales. It could mean that your best employee left the organization because they felt that the person working beside them didn't share the same values with that compelling future focus, that the thread broke when it was woven through the person beside them. So we have sometimes millions of dollars in cost, unmeasurable cost, when we hire the wrong person. And so let's assume that if good people come in front of us, we're always going to hire them. Let's spend our time not hiring the mediocre people or even the poor people.
Yeah, that this cost question comes up all the time as I think about even selling people on the idea of, hey, do this better. When you do it better, you're going to save money. And the numbers that I've looked at, that the research that I've done looks and says that at the very smallest entry level position, the cost of getting it wrong might start as low as maybe $5,000 or $6,000, but very quickly goes up into the $20,000, $30,000 range and can get up, like you said, if it's a higher level position, sales position, whatever it is, it can be in the millions quite easily. I want to, this all begs the question, and another question for me, and that is, okay, so who do you hire as the ideal behavioral interviewer? Who makes the ideal behavioral interviewer?
That's a good question. First off, I don't think a person with a super high ego is a great behavioral interviewer. I think a person who's, if we're going to use the traits profiling tool, and again, it doesn't matter whether or not you're using colors or any other one of the any one of the hundreds of other profiling tools. At the end of the day, they're all pretty accurate. Mostly what differentiates the profiling tools is the mechanism of which you administer it and whether or not the reporting that it gives you is suit is really fits well with your organization and the kinds of people you hire. But the theory is the theory. The concept is the concept, and most of them are not that much wrong or worse or better than the others. And so when we get a person who's extremely assertive, who thinks that everything they do is right, they're probably more inclined to want to hire in their own image because they think their image is perfect or better. So that's not good. It's not objective. Um, they probably don't listen so well. Because I'm really high in the assertive trait. I'm a terrible listener. I mean, I think I'm a great listener, and I speak at conferences, and I talk about guerrilla listening, but really, you know, I just understand the importance of it. I'm not good at it. I'm really not good at it. Like I try and try and try because it matters. But some people are way better listeners. So I think that having um, people who are less assertive and are able to look at things critically without a pre disposition as to what's better, right, or wrong. Because the interview is going to take you down a bunch of paths. And the first way a person answers a question might make you inclined to believe something, particularly if you're that super high ego person. You're thinking, oh, that's just like Johnny, he failed. This person's going to fail. You know, Having the patience and not feeling like you're absolutely right away to go through the whole process to look at all the answers and all the information on balance together and how it works together. I think that's the best kind of person. And I've always said that, for example, in the recruitment and staffing services industry, they have this thing called the 360 desk. So this is the person who, you've met the executive search consultant or they go out to the organization and they sell their services and they get the order, then they go back and they start headhunting and evaluating candidates, and then presenting candidates and, all that kind of stuff. And they're very often highly dominant, assertive people who kind of know it all. And they're really hard to replace because these high assertive people are hard to find. But they really could do better if they had an assistant or a coworker who was less dominant, who was kind of working behind the scenes, quietly evaluating candidates based upon what they're really like, not what the assertive person wants to make them like or think they're like or prove they're like. So I think less assertiveness, more patience, and understanding, but not so empathetic that they give everybody a break.
Based on whatever story
Because
is
people,
coming in at the moment. Would another, I'm guessing another trait would be that somebody is curious, but not overly curious. Not curious to the point where they're just asking questions just for the sake of asking questions or getting
yeah,
to know them. It has to be pointed. It's funny, when you were talking about noticing patterns, I thought, yes, this is Psych 101, right? When something happens once, it could be a random chance, it can be anything. When something happens 2 or 3 times in similar situations, there's a pattern here. Now, what does the pattern
yeah,
mean? That's another good question, but there's a
yeah,
pattern here and we need to investigate that. Would that be accurate with the curiosity?
yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of jobs and roles where you don't want to have super dominant traits. If you know how the traits ideograph works, there are lots of jobs where it's really important to be in the middle. Not say let's take organizational discipline, detail orientation. There's lots of jobs where being overly detail oriented, to all those T's crossed and I's dotted and everything perfect and the research done, this can be paralysis by analysis. You could have a person not getting things done because they just have to make it perfect or check it out again or find out. And then, of course, there's the other end of the spectrum where people could just be flying by the seat of their pants and, going in there guns a-blazing and making mistakes and not being prepared for the meeting and, showing up late and not knowing where to park and, who knows. And and so sometimes um, a trait not being dominant one way or the other is important too. And knowing how to understand that the fact that maybe that isn't important, that it's okay, that that they recognize the value of it, but it doesn't make it a predominant, predictable, recurring theme in their personality. My wife's really competitive. And so, like on my honeymoon, there's lots of things she would have rather been doing, but she had to beat me at canasta. And she kept track of how many times she beat me at canasta. Because, and she told me on the way home on the plane how many times she beat me at canasta. Very predictable behavior every day. Hey, you want to play canasta? And we start to see these themes in people's personalities. But sometimes it's okay for it to not be a dominant theme, just just present enough.
Yeah, that it's a the answer you've given me is subtle and complex, not simple, which is appreciated here, Steve, because
Yeah.
this is not a cut and dried process. There needs to be some adaptivity here when we are going into this and doing our best to figure people out and to help an organization in specific ways. I just looked at the time. We've been in at this for 50 minutes and it's
Wow.
flown by for me. I think I've got another million questions for you, but how about we do this? Let's cut it here just to because we've covered a few pieces I think well. We can get into them a lot deeper. And I wanted to make sure I gave you a chance just to talk about some of the other stuff you do. You've hinted at the companies that you're helping and some of the consulting that you've done. Maybe give a little bit of just a plug for yourself when it comes to some of the consulting you've done, and then we'll talk maybe even about the business that you're running right now, if that helps you at all.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. Well, Business Leadership Corp, Steve Jones Business Leadership Corp, it really is somewhat unfocused in the sense that our only goal and objective is to help people to perform and to be the best that they possibly can be. So that can be executive leadership, that could be performance management, that could be sales training. It could be, a whole bunch of things. It could be developing strategic plans and, organizational management. Um, and we end up doing training for industry associations, and I speak two conferences in the last 2 weeks. I was in Montreal last week and Ottawa the week before, speaking at conferences. That's fun stuff. But on the other side, I ended up in the home care business a little over 10 years ago because I had a client who wanted me to help consult him in the purchasing of a home care franchise. And so we started doing our normal consulting work and said, hey, this looks like a pretty good business, but I think it should be bigger than what you're planning. And so I invested in the business and then ended up owning the business eventually. And so we've got this home care business where it's so great because I'm always been business to business. This is helping families with their aging parents to remain safely and comfortably living in their own home, the place that they always wanted to stay to until the end of their life, that we get them caregivers and nurses and people to come into their home to help them to stay there and remain there. And so first off, it feels different. It feels different than just performance management. This is about making a meaningful difference in a very measurable and specific way in people's lives. And every client, you can see how we're touching their family and making a difference. But the part of the story that I want to go to is how fast we grew and how we outgrew the franchise organization that we bought into because they treated it like home care. And they hired occupational therapists and physiotherapists and nurses to manage franchises and branches. And they found franchisees with those backgrounds. And they were very functional in the tasks that they performed and the skills that they had to perform those tasks. And we came at it from a behavioral standpoint. And we said, let's hire people that are going to care, that are going to answer the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning. They're going to get up and notice at 5:30 in the morning that a caregiver is sick and they can't make it to look after, a senior citizen, and they're supposed to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning to help them to get up and get dressed, and that they'll get on the phone and they'll book a replacement person for them. And it wasn't that they were more qualified as a nurse to pick the person who's going to go there. It's that they possessed these personality traits. And you keep using the term predominant, predictable, recurring themes in their personality that it mattered to them, that they were going to help people and change their lives. And yet they were so driven that there was no amount of work that was too much work. And that instead of feeling stressed about it, that they felt empowered and they loved it, that they came away energized by it. And so finding the unique personalities, I didn't care if you were in human resources or you were an engineer or you were a nurse. It didn't matter to me what you did, because if we need a nurse, we're going to hire a nurse to give them the needle. I don't need the case manager who's going to look after the family to give needles. And so we hired I think Wayne has said this before, or you hire pigs to wallow in the mud, and you hire canaries to sing, and of course you can get a pig to sing, and they're going to do it. They're not going to do it well, and as soon as you turn their back, they're going to go stop singing and go back to the mud again. Hire people to do the things that they love to do, and that they do well, and don't ask them to do the things that don't even expect them to. Don't write it into the job description, the things that they don't love to do. So our home care business has really thrived. Like, I mean, we got so big, we had to leave the franchise system because we became bigger than them, and we did it because we hired people who would perform the tasks of the job, but they had goals, wants, desires, fears, needs to do things in an extraordinary way, to get extraordinary results. And that feels good. So I love doing the consulting, I love speaking, all that stuff, but the business to consumer home care business has taken this whole concept and proven that, boy, you can take it anywhere, and it really, really works.
That is a brilliant way to wrap this up too, because we talked about behavioral interviewing, and you wrap this up by saying you used all of these skills to bring about or build a really, really cool organization for yourself
Yeah,
and
thank
for
you.
the people that you're
That's
serving.
exactly. Yep, actually.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you for this,
Well, I
Steve.
really appreciate it today. Thank you. Yes, great questions.
No, this is a lot of fun. Again, I'll probably be reaching out to you at some point in time to pick your brain and bug you to do this again in 6 months or a year here. Okay. All right. I'm positive that you've got a feel for how much value this interview will be for multiple organizations. So I want you to do a number of things. I'm going to summarize a couple of things here, but one thing I want you to do is I want you to tell other people about this interview. If there's an organization, if there's somebody that you know needs to hear this, share it with them, because we're getting the experience, the value from somebody who has done so much. He's gotten to know so many companies, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies, and he's bringing that value to you. Now, as far as summaries, a few different things. I heard Steve talk about greatest mistakes, kind of panel interviewing or structured interviews rather than behavioral interviews. Really, what I'm going to do is summarize what the behavioral interview is from my perspective, specifically from what Steve said. So one, he talked about a CAR acronym for BI, behavioral interviewing. Sorry. C is context, A is actions, R is results. So constantly finding similar situations to what they will experience in your job offering, asking how the actions, how did they interact or act or react to certain situations or experiences, and then what were the results of that for the car. So context, what happened, actions, how did you deal with that, or context was what the situation was, actions is how did they interact or react, what did they do, and the results, what happened because of that. And again, we're listening between the lines with this stuff. Okay, so starting from most recent to least recent is what Steve does. But why did they change jobs or positions? What was going on? Again, you're starting broad and getting more specific, trying to figure out what is going on here. Why? What is the pattern here? Why did people leave jobs? Why did they look for change? For the intro to BI interviews, how does this all start? How do they react and interact with you? How quickly do they feel comfortable? What is their body language like? Steve said this is at least 5 minutes before anything even gets started. Take some notes while things do move along. What are this person's priorities? Pay attention to what does this person react to in certain situations? How do they react? Does this person make eye contact and have great communication skills if they're interviewing for a sales job? Do they make great eye contact and have great communication skills, but they're applying for some kind of backroom dungeon type job where it's bum up, head down, they will never interact with anyone? Why? Because if they've got great communication skills and they make great eye contact, they're probably better for the first role and probably awful for the second role because it's going to become distracting for that second role. Two aspects or two things that Steve is looking for. One, does the personality that this person presents suit the role that we need? And secondly, are they an organization or cultural fit? He specifically said, listen, we're looking for everyone to be an organization cultural fit, but we're looking for different people to fit different roles. Next, we talked about job descriptions. What will they accomplish in the next year or two? So what will the person accomplish in the next year or two? And how will they be rewarded for accomplishing what they need to accomplish? He talked about outcomes and tasks, to focus on outcomes instead of tasks, to attaboy the tasks, but to really reward the outcomes. Last, well, I guess a couple more things. First is costs of getting this wrong. Steve, and this is so important, really, really wisely said, severance is the least of your concerns or the least of the costs. Yes, there's a cost of severance, but more importantly, there's lost opportunity costs, loss of sales, loss of future business, loss of losing other employees and causing a cascade. I can think of a number of organizations that I've been part of where because one person was disgruntled, it caused a cascade of changes that needed to take place. Maybe you'd argue that those needed to take place anyway, but I think you get my point. I asked a question about what would Steve look for in an interviewer? What would the ideal interviewer be like? And he said, find somebody without ego, maybe less super assertive or aggressive, somebody who listens extremely well, doesn't jump to conclusions. Thirdly, somebody who has patience to follow the process. And fourthly, probably not somebody who's crazy empathetic because they might get lost rather than sticking to that process. There were other things involved here. We're starting to run out of time with the interview, and I was trying to respect Steve's time. Brilliant interview. Steve, if you're listening to this, thank you so much for your help. Thank you so much for your insight. And I'm hoping, I think I often say this to people, but I hope you got all that I got out of this. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed it. And again, that you share it with other people. Steve did mention a couple of other businesses here. Feel free to go to the show notes. I've got a really brief show notes for this because we talked about big concepts for longer periods of time. But for Steve's consulting business, for his in-home assisted living business, please go to the show notes and we'll provide links there. Enjoy your day.